Now I would like to give the word to Mrs Rilasciati from the Austrian Economic Chamber of Commerce to give us some analysis of impact on Austrian companies and Austrian economy.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah, you just said, is it a comedy or a tragedy? From an economic point of view, it's clear it's a lose-lose situation. On both sides of the channels, there are the losers. We have big losers in the European Union. Austria is not among the big losers. For Austria, it's bad news, but it's not a disaster. The UK for Austria ranges among our 10 most important export partners, but we're not talking about Germany, Italy, Switzerland, US. So it's far behind. For goods, it's our number 9 trading partner. We already lost a little bit. It used to be number 8. And we already feel a little bit the first Brexit effects, for example, the weak pound and the insecurity. For services, the UK is our number 5 trading partner. And it seems that it remains like this. British people still want to do their holidays in the Austrian Alps, and it seems that it doesn't matter so far whether the pound is 15% less or more strong so far. We do have business services, and we also are strong in transport services. Overall, there are thousands of Austrian companies in business with the UK. However, many of them do have sporadic business or in small volumes. There are around 250 companies who export to the UK, and they account for 90% of our exports. So 250 big companies, and then we do have around 250 subsidiaries in the UK. They are, a third of them are producing, and they still employ around 45,000 employees. So with regard to direct effects, of course, also Austria will be a loser and feel the direct effects, but it will be in the GDP growth a reduction of 0.1 to 0.3%. Unemployed, or the figures you said before, we have different figures. For example, a Deloitte study says around 800 jobs might be lost. The assumption of this study is that exports would deteriorate by 25% of the German study. And we are not that skeptic. We don't believe that exports would be reduced by 25%. But still, direct effects will be felt. What is our big fear are the indirect effects via Germany. Austria is a big supplier to the German industry, the car industry, especially in Styria and in Upper Austria. And for Germany, UK used to be number 3 trading partner. It's now number 5. And if Germany feels Brexit, Austria feels Brexit as well. And companies have strong fears of this indirect effects. We in the Austrian Chamber of Commerce, we started our Brexit information campaign in early autumn when it was clear that negotiations really don't progress. And we started with a website and checklists, and I was touring all over in all 9 regions in Austria, and we have a Brexit information point. And in the beginning I said to my colleagues, nobody will call us. And then we were overwhelmed how many companies were calling us during the last month, and also media. So there is a big of interest and a big of insecurity regarding Brexit. Most, I would say 1/4 of the companies calling us are big companies. They are very well prepared. They prepare themselves since the referendum, since almost 3 years now. But they call us because of very specific questions with regard to British employees or taxes. 3/4 of the companies calling us are SMEs. And SMEs are sometimes not well prepared. It's not because they are stupid and don't believe Brexit will never come. It's because they simply lack of resources. They don't have the resources to prepare themselves to the various scenarios. Deal or no deal, or Norway, or Switzerland, or Turkey, they simply can't. Some of them never have been making trade or trading outside the European single market. So they really have to start from the beginning to familiarize themselves with how is a customs procedure working, and they really have to inform themselves about the basics. Just have to have a look whether I forgot something to tell you. Yeah, very important as well is that most Austrian exports are niche products or high-tech products, or we are very successful in the UK with assembly and construction services, and they are difficult to be replaced because simply the UK has not the knowledge in these areas, or they don't have qualified workers. So the companies don't fear that they will be replaced, or they will be working in the UK anymore. The big fear is that it will be much more complicated. It will be much more cost-intensive, money, bureaucratic. That's their fear. And my last point is, I'd say more than 1,000 companies contacted us. I spoke to many of them, and not a single one is in favor of Brexit. Not a single one. But they all complain because of the slow progress in the negotiation and now in the British Parliament. And this Brexit cloud is hanging over us for 3 years now. And what businesses need is security. They are now in this situation of insecurity for 3 years. They cannot do mid or long-term planning, and they simply want this situation to end. Nobody wants a no-deal Brexit, but we also don't want this situation to continue on the cost of insecurity for the next, let's say, months or years. So this is what Austrian companies feel like. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the floor is yours, Mr. Käfer, as representative of the European Commission, to give us the big perspective.
I will try to speak without micro, but from here, because it's better for me to see you more in detail. So, thank you for the invitation. My name is Hatto Käfer. I am an official of the European Commission and currently working in the representation in Austria. I just want to give some background to Brexit, to the past, and give some indication what has been done in order to prepare Brexit best. As you know, the history of Great Britain with regard to the European Union or to continental Europe always has been somewhat specific. I don't want to go back to the year 6000 before Jesus Christ, when the Ice Age ended and the Doggerland has been flooded and Great Britain or United Kingdom became an island. But I want to go back to 1961, when the United Kingdom for the first time asked to be part of the European Union. It has been refused 2 years later by Charles de Gaulle. Then they asked again, 1967. It has been refused again by Charles de Gaulle in the same year. And only after the French president has ended his term, then Great Britain, United Kingdom, had a chance to become partner of the European Union. This was in the year 1973. And what we generally do not know today, so they joined 1973, already 1975, 2 years later, there was a referendum in Great Britain, shall we stay or not? At that time, 65 or 70% opted in favor for staying within the European Union. And then you all remember 1984, 1985, the strong character. The British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, wanted the money back, and she succeeded, and since then we have the Britain repaid. So, to put it in a nutshell, the general orientation of the policy of the United Kingdom always was in favor of enlargement of the European Union, but highly skeptical or reluctant as concerns the deepening of the European Union. And we see it in the opt-outs in the number of important policy areas. Most important, they do not make part of the Schengen Agreement, so don't forget their passport. They are not part of the Economic and Monetary Union. They did not sign the Charter of Fundamental Rights and of the European Union. And they, in times of terrorism and security threats, also an important point, the United Kingdom has an opt-out in the area of freedom, security and justice, which makes collaboration much more difficult. So this is the long history. Just to come to the short history, real Brexit started on 23rd January 2030, when David Cameron held his keynote address on Europe, where he made clear that Britain has specific interests and they have to think about Brexit. The political reason was clear. He wanted to keep calm his right wing, I might want to say, plus UKIP. So this was more or less internal politics which led him to this act. And between 2013 and February 2016, when he announced the referendum, the European Union, behind the scenes, on the scenes, negotiated very intensively in order to avoid it. But he did not succeed. All what we had to offer was not enough. And then the decision for referendum has been taken. And as you know, 23rd of June 2016, we all in Brussels, at that time I lived in Brussels, we could not believe it the day after. We all were of the opinion, yes, they will hold the referendum and then everything goes on. For us Eurocrats, if I may use this expression, it was a real surprise, and I regret not having speculated like George Soros against the British pound. So, anyway, then more or less 1 year later, negotiations finally started. So in June 2017, but already in December 2017, it was clear for the Commission that there is a good chance or a high risk that negotiations will not succeed. And since then, we are preparing for all scenarios. And as it already has been said, all European institutions, Parliament, Council, Commission, are of the clear opinion that it is a lose-lose situation. There's nothing to win in it, and all what we are doing is to mitigate the negative effects or to avoid them. And just to be clear, what has been negotiated? Two documents. The first one with more or less 600 pages. This is the withdrawal agreement, which always is discussed in Parliament. And the other one with about 40 pages, a very general, fluffy outline how the future collaboration could be, which, in my opinion, is even more important than that was discussed. Up to date, no concrete negotiation has been done what concerns the future after the withdrawal. It's always just letter of intent, if you want to know. So, to end, what are the initiatives which the European Commission, the executive of the European Union, has taken in order to prepare for Brexit? First of all, we have prepared a number of legislative acts, which most of them already have been adopted by Council and Parliament. For example, for Erasmus Plus, for the students, we have made provisions, for visa policy, for the railway safety. But also important, as you know, maybe Austria had a certain stake in it. We prepared for the relocation of the European Medicines Agency, as well as of the European Banking Authority. So this was the big legislative acts. Without going into the details of our law systems, otherwise I would come into current political discussions. There are legal acts of minor importance. We call them comitology acts, implementing acts, which the European Commission can decide on its own. There we provided for Galileo, for example, for tariff rate quotas, but also for feed additives and things like that. These are the legal acts. On the political side, we established a number of communications for the other European institutions in order to enable them to be well prepared. And we have drafted so-called preparedness notice, more than 90. These are preparedness notices to the stakeholders. Stakeholders can be companies, can be member states, can be municipalities, but also individual citizens, in order to tell them what can come towards them, for what do they have to prepare. Also, every policy area has been covered: waste law, e-commerce, energy market, things like that. And last but not least, we made finally some practical guidance for the member states in important policy areas like data protection or medicinal products. And we also had a hotline and signpost service for citizens. But not only we, the Commission, prepared, also the member states prepared. In Austria, there was a Brexit steering group led by the Federal Chancellery, where about 50 participants met weekly. This have been all ministries, but also the Wirtschaftskammer, the other social partners, the representation of the federal provinces, and so on. And finally, they made an omnibus law, so-called Brexit Begleitgesetz, which provided for about 15 legal areas. It's one of the funniest laws I ever have seen, because the title is one page. Brexit Begleitgesetz is only the formal title, but the real title is one page. And even the federal provinces made specific laws in order to prepare for Brexit, because there are some competencies on federal level, like the sale of real estate, social aid, and so on. But also the social partners, in a very efficient way, did what has to be done. So whatever will come, we do not like what will come, but we are prepared for that. And maybe just to end, a personal remark from my side. I'm very satisfied and I'm really proud how the European Union has negotiated with Great Britain, even if in Great Britain you have a different view, because in my opinion, we, the 27, we really stick together. So the divide et impera did not work. And we also think that we offered to the United Kingdom a fair deal on which we can build a future on a new basis. So we cannot see what the future will bring. As John Maynard Keynes said it, in the long run we are all dead. But until then, I hope we will see a good Brexit, which will allow us to work together efficiently and in a harmonious way in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Käfer, for your statement and short analysis. Now let us proceed to our panel discussion. I prepared a few questions for our guests, and then, of course, it will be also the turn of the audience to ask the questions. So first of all, I will ask the question. All of you can answer, or those who feel they have opinion concerning these topics. So what are the main questions and concerns from your perspective that companies, and especially Austrian and UK companies, face in regard to Brexit?
The main, well, the companies calling us are so diverse as Brexit is. So we receive questions from small travel agencies to big production companies, to services and so on. But for example, to give you an insight, one favorite question in Austria was, our company employs a British citizen. Do we have to fire him after Brexit? So, but this, without the Austrian contingency planning and without the Austrian law, British citizens could not continue to work in Austria. We need the legislation in order to keep British citizens in our company. So in the end, it's not funny. Or another question was, we do have around 400 to 500 British Limited in Austria. And in the no-deal Brexit case, there wouldn't be a legally recognized entity anymore in Austria. So we do have this Brexit legislation, and they continue with British Limited at least until the end of 2020, and only have to find a new solution in this time. Typical questions are businesses are from businesses doing business over Brexit. So we had a carpenter in the UK with his whole team for some assembly work, and he was there in the beginning of March, and he had to end his work in April. And he did not know what will happen, because being over Brexit in the UK, he did not know, may I stay there? Do I need a visa? What do I do with my employees? Do they need a posting of work as a permit? What with health insurance? My e-card is not valid anymore in the UK. My social security is not valid in the UK anymore. I do have my, I don't know, equipment, my hammer or whatever in the, I need. It was delivered as an intra-community delivery before, but how do I get it back? Because getting it back means after Brexit importing it. You have to pay, you have to do all the formalities, and you have to pay tariffs. We have travel agencies with school groups in the UK, and they don't know what the flight connections will be and whether they would need visa. So we have all kinds of questions, and I think I could talk now for hours, but I stop here now, and maybe we can elaborate it later on.
And I think it's interesting from the British perspective, looking the other way. Of course, the British perspective is of issues that might come up between Britain and any country in the European Union, not just Austria, of course. And I think British companies that work in the European Union fall into two categories. One category knows very well what the specific rules and regulations are in one country compared with another. So Austria's rules compared with Germany, compared with France. Others don't really have a sense that these things are very different. They may know one country quite well and may assume that regulations in other countries are very similar because of the straightforward or simplistic, really, view that a lot of British take about Europe, that Europe is one thing. The European Union is a united set of countries that have very similar and the same rules, if you like. Certainly the people I've spoken to about working in Europe are mostly consultants, so not manufacturers, for example. It's my own personal experience. I work with other consultants. And their view has always been that they will work in Europe, overseas as we call it, because you have to go overseas to get there. They will work in Europe until somebody tells them that they shouldn't be there or there's some other rule, and that they will sort out what needs to be done quickly in the belief that it will be done quickly. And I think part of the issue for the British is that the British have been very open about saying that when the rules change, we will treat people from Europe the same as we did before. Whether or not that applies in a no-deal Brexit, I don't know, because nobody knows, I think, what will happen. I think, pragmatically speaking, if people are in the other country, they won't suddenly need a visa or suddenly need permission or suddenly find that they can't go to hospital, because that would be outrageous. It would be inhuman, actually. And I don't think the British would want that to happen. But I understand the kind of comments and the questions that your clients are asking.
I would just like to add, it's true, British politicians promised you will be able to provide your services the same as you do now, but they are lagging behind in legislation. They did not do their homework, and sorry,
No, it's true.
and so we don't have it in a no-deal case. We don't have the legislation in the UK for it, and we only have the promise. And companies cannot work only on promises. So this is one of the big issues, and I cannot tell the companies, yes, Theresa May said you will be able to continue working. This is not enough for somebody.
And I think the approach that you describe has summarizes the British approach to the negotiations, that in principle it'll all be fine. In practice we'll work it out, but don't worry about it. And of course that's not a very sensible way to negotiate, and that has been the problem, I think, with the British politicians who have come over to Brussels with vague intentions, well-meaning, but not the level of detail that was apparent from the European side straight away. Interestingly, at the beginning of June, I mentioned at the beginning of June that the Parliament will be enacting, we hope, the parliamentary bill to bring into British law all of the European laws that apply at the time of Brexit. That has not been done yet. And you mentioned, I think, that these are the things that other countries have been doing. It has not been done in Britain yet for two reasons. One is it's a big job. And this parliamentary bill that is being presented has, many hundreds of pages that must go into British law before the date of Britain leaving. Otherwise, as you say, there will be no legal basis upon which the rights that Britain wants to offer can legally apply. And the main reason that is stopping this is that Parliament cannot agree on whether or not it wants to accept the negotiated position that the government has agreed with Europe through Theresa May's intervention. And I think it shows, as I mentioned earlier, that the government in Britain and Parliament are two completely different things. And I think one of the things in Britain that people have now learnt, the public have now learnt, is the difference between the government and the Parliament. That we rarely in Britain have ever had such a difference between the government's perspective, the government has been negotiating with Europe, and Parliament's perspective. And the two have to be aligned. We cannot proceed unless the two are aligned, and this is the obstacle in Britain right now.
Thank you. It's really interesting to hear all that, because normally we read about all these topics on the political level in newspapers, but it actually impacts our everyday life and of the companies. I mean, we were talking about companies in general. Maybe do you have any more details on the impact of Brexit on consulting companies specifically?
Apart from the fact that consulting companies see opportunity everywhere, everywhere there is change, there is an opportunity for consultants. So if consultants are commercially minded, they will find work to do. And Brexit is an opportunity in that respect. I think the biggest issue that is causing problems for the big consultancies is staffing. That, of course, if you look in the London offices of the large consulting firms, there are many people in those offices who are from other countries in Europe. And the worry is that those people will either feel that legally they will lose the right to work, and of course that will be a problem for consultants, or somehow emotionally they won't feel safe or they won't feel welcomed after Brexit, and therefore will be inclined to return back to their own countries. And I think that's one of the biggest issues for the large consulting firms that's happening right now.
Thank you. The Austrian perspective?
Well, from the Austrian perspective, of course, Brexit is also a business for consultancies, but we also get some response of difficulties of consultancies, not for the big consultancies who all have their office in London, but the small ones, because in the case of a no-deal scenario, WTO regime would apply. So your consultancy would be under the no-for regime, and you could not travel to the UK and provide your service. You could only provide your service being in Austria, from Austria to the UK, but you would not be under WTO regime unless UK will introduce some other law, be allowed to provide services in the UK. This is a big problem, for example. Another problem, not only for Austrian companies, but for all EU companies, would be data protection. There's the data protection regulation, and UK would be treated, for example, like a third country in the future time. So it's not only hooray, watch out, there will be a lot of changes in service provision.
I think if I may add that we know that consultancy is mainly a local business. There's not a lot of consultancy that is traded across borders because the competitive advantage of consultants is that they know their local market typically. And the same is true in Britain, that more than 80% of British consultancy is carried out in Britain. And therefore it's less of an impact on transferring services overseas. I think what would happen, personally, my own opinion, is that a lot of this will become virtual trade, that people will find it very easy to do work in one country and deliver a service in another, online training, things of this type, because that's not really trading across border. You don't have to physically go there to do it. The money flows will be interesting to work out how that will happen. There may be duties, there may be taxes that have to be paid. But I think we'll find a lot more because of e-enabled transactions and e-enabled services that are likely to take place. And Britain, of course, is very bad at speaking other languages. We've had this discussion on previous events like this one, that I'm always very embarrassed that you speak perfect English. We have these discussions in English. If they were in German, I would be completely lost. I wouldn't know where to start. And in some ways, therefore, Britain is at a big disadvantage, that consultancies and consultants in other countries that speak other languages can often do very well at providing services in Britain for British people because their English is so good. And we don't really see that as a problem because everybody speaks English. But of course it's a big problem because for us British consultants to come and do work in Austria, for me it would be impossible. I cannot speak German at anything like the level that is necessary to have a conversation about a business issue with a client. I would have to be working with somebody that was a native perhaps, or somebody that had learnt to speak German and understood the local market. So I think the issue about consultancy across borders is much more about resources that are required to work in different countries, and maybe it will stimulate a lot more electronic and e-communication rather than physical necessity to be there.
Thank you. For the export consultants among us, maybe just a small remark from my side, due to all these uncertainties that we have and due to the value of the pound going rather down, the exports become more expensive to the UK, and so the assumption is that as for the new business, there will be less companies that are interested in going to the UK. But on the other side, those businesses that are already established on the UK market will, in the case of a no-deal scenario, have more difficulties to face, and they will need more support in as far as export is concerned. So for those of us who are active in the export consulting, there will be many chances, I think, if this scenario comes.
I think your point about currency value is very important. Of course, when the British pound dropped on the date of the referendum, or the day after the referendum, by 15%, and it stayed that level, of course, since then. Everything from abroad became more expensive, so actually everybody was affected by this. And of course, yes, that meant that some imports were diminished. But I don't think Austria has any more of a problem than anybody else trying to export to Britain in that respect, that everything has become more expensive for us. But we will still make our choice about Austrian technology and vehicles and so on. As a motorcyclist myself, of course, I'm very interested in how KTM export to the UK. I don't think their bikes are much good, I'm sorry to say. I ride a Triumph motorcycle, which of course is British, and therefore I feel comfortable with that. But KTM has a big following in the UK as a vehicle brand, as a motorcycle brand. And we haven't seen a substantial drop in demand for their motorcycles since the Brexit vote. It's actually, as far as I'm aware, their share of the motorcycle market has stayed constant. So actually, yes, of course, you're right, things become more expensive, but people still make the choice to buy these things because of the quality, because Austrian, the image of Austrian manufacturing is of high quality manufacturing in the UK, whether it's domestic housing, building products, or whether it's vehicles and so on and so forth.
Geht das jetzt? Ja. I would like to add that it's also very difficult to say, for example, our exports in chemical products went down by around 10%, also food products, but sometimes it's also stockpiling in the UK with regard to chemical products. So it might be the price, but it might have other reasons as well, and we cannot tell now, because for example, also in 2018, especially in the last months, we observed an increase in exports again, and it might also be stockpiling. We are now waiting what will happen after Brexit. This will be the interesting question.
What is your advice to companies? How to prepare for Brexit?
Well, our advice is if you have never been operating outside the single market, hurry up. Ask for an AORI number, familiarize yourself with customs procedures. Our advice is, for example, we have pharmaceutical companies who have customs in Northern Ireland, and we taught them to do stockpiling, at least for the next 6 months. They did it, and now they're really fed up because they did stockpiling for the 29th of March. And then it was postponed to April, and now it's postponed to October. And this is one of the big problems of many companies. They did their homework, they did preparation, but it was to a certain extent for nothing. So we also recommend our companies to look at the supply chain, to look whether they have, for example, suppliers from the UK. This is in sometimes it's easy, but we did, for example, we had the biggest Austrian automotive producer in the VKÖ, and he told us they have 5,000 suppliers. They had to scrutinize, and the 5,000 suppliers each of them had 5 suppliers, and then the 5 suppliers had others. So they were busy the last 3 years only with screening the suppliers. We also recommend to clarify with your business partner who has to bear the costs of a Brexit. If, for example, if you have from one day to the other tariffs, or for example, if you're late in delivery, who is responsible for that? Maybe to revise your contracts. This is not so easy. Doing short-term contracts, doing Brexit clauses in the contracts, but I'm not a British legal expert, but we are now in British law, and the British law does not really recognize clauses because you have the case law system. So it's not clear, for example, if you're late, if the product costs more in the end, whether you will protect it by your clause. So we really recommend also to document everything. So at least when it comes to a no-deal Brexit, you have a documentation of it. And then very simply, we have to recommend, please, now we say, please avoid end October, beginning of November, because this is the next possible date for a no-deal Brexit.
Thank you. Just one last question. And then the floor is yours. Which scenario is the most probable from today's perspective?
I don't know.
I don't believe in a no deal. I'm still optimistic, and I really hope for a no deal, because for not to have a no deal, because nobody wants a no deal. So, and the European Union was always good with coming up with a solution. So I truly hope for a solution.
So as a matter of fact, nobody really knows. But even if there was a hard Brexit in end of October, at the end of the day, a reasonable attitude will prevail. So in relative short time, new provisions will be found. So a hard Brexit is not a catastrophe forever, only for a short, limited period, in my opinion.
Yeah, yes, I share that view. I think that it feels, certainly in Britain, that there's a lot of, like playing poker here, you know, who will go to the very last point before they move. And I think the British had hoped that the European Union would be more flexible earlier, but the European Union have been resolute in their position on the deal that has been negotiated. And I think what may happen is that in the days before the end of October, I think there may be a lot of anguish and a lot of fuss. But I think, and there may even be no deal for 3 days, and it will be catastrophic for 3 days, but it will be resolved. I agree. I think a no deal would be a disaster for Britain, apart from anybody else. And it feels to me that the Germans and the French particularly, although they have a public stance to be firm and agree with European principles, I get the sense that they would move, and they would encourage other countries to move if a no deal seemed like that was going to happen. The problem is then that people will play games. People will go to the very last minute of the very last day before eventually giving in. And I don't think that's the way to do business, really. That's not how you would do a business deal, is it, really? You would organize it in advance, you would know what was going on. And that's why the business community is so fed up with the politicians, I think, all over, that they can't get this right. It feels that our politicians in Britain don't understand the fact that business is actually quite important for Britain, and without it, we would be lost. And I think when the politicians finally realise this, it may be quite late in the day.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the audience?
My name is Christian Ebner. I'm a management consultant. We have learned that companies would like to have a fast decision, and maybe a decision which is foreseeable for some time. So if Britain is leaving in end of October, it would be nice to know in July what exactly the scenario will be. That would be good for companies. For politicians, strangely, it's the other way around. They kick the can, that they try to avoid unpleasant decisions, and they obviously seem to like to postponing things and to negotiate the things at the very last moment. Well, I understand a little bit the EU politicians that they didn't want to come up with a no deal before the EU elections, because it would be a very unpleasant situation for them, having to explain, actually, we had a good position, but we didn't manage to close a deal. Wouldn't be good. I don't understand actually why Britain postponed the decision, because actually the position is quite clear. In the end of December, we knew, okay, you cannot agree. There's one point, the backstop. Actually, they could agree on most things except the backstop. And this is the only field of disagreement. So actually it's clear. Or somebody is making a move towards the other side, or there's a no deal. It's pretty clear. Nothing has changed since the end of last year. So my main question is, why did Britain postpone?
Okay, I'll try and answer that question. I think there are two issues here. One is the backstop. I'll come back to that in a moment. But the other one is the issue that the Parliament at the moment is split, as I've mentioned. No one political party has a dominant position, and even if it did, the factions within each party would mean that the Remainers and the Leavers would still be reasonably evenly split. I think the issue we're facing in Parliament is that if a general election is called, which is a possibility, then the new Parliament, the new government, whoever that is, would want to have the right to start again, because of course they've been elected, and they would want to come back to Europe to say, well, okay, we like most of this, but there are three things here that our voters don't want, and this would be a real problem, because that could not be sorted out, I think, at the end of October. I think the timing would be ridiculous, and it would be another delay until the following March, and more uncertainty for business, and so on and so forth. So I hope that doesn't happen, but I think if I were betting, I would say there is a possibility that could happen. I would put some money on that somewhere, a little maybe. I think the issue of the backstop, we haven't really mentioned the backstop yet. and I don't know how long you've got, but this goes back to British history with Ireland, back in, more than 100 years. And the fact that the island of Ireland, so I'll do my best to pronounce this correctly, the island of Ireland and the British territory, the British part of it called Northern Ireland, and the southern part of it called the Republic of Ireland are separate countries. The Republic is in the European Union and is remaining in the European Union. The North is part of Britain and will leave. And the issue about how that border is managed is very difficult. It's a bit easier when we have the sea in the way, because the routes for entry and exit are controllable, then they're relatively few. And if we put a fence up across the border of Northern Ireland and Ireland, then we risk all the peace negotiations that went on and led to the Good Friday Agreement 20 and more years ago. And nobody in Britain or Ireland wants to see a return to the violent terrorism and civil unrest that was the case at that time. And so overlaid on top of the need to have a border and to have trade across that border is the political desire to not go backwards in social and history. And that is a big problem, I have to say. Interestingly enough, there are many people in England, so Northern Ireland is quite a small population. There are many people in England who say, well, we should leave them to it, I have to say. Let the Irish sort the Irish out. A very negative attitude. People in Northern Ireland, the majority of people in Northern Ireland want to remain in Britain. There is a sizable minority that don't. They are split as well, but in an uneven basis. And it's actually very difficult to find a solution to that problem. And I don't know what the answer will be, I have to say. I hope that a technological solution that has been discussed, where trade across the border can be monitored somehow, and that there isn't a problem with smuggling, there isn't a problem with controlling that trade. I hope that that is possible. I honestly don't know. But for the British, the European politicians who suggested that maybe the border could be the sea and we could draw a line around it, most British people felt that it was outrageously simple and how stupid the Europeans were to think of that. And that created a lot of emotion in Britain at that time, which hasn't gone away. Of course, the memory is that somebody somewhere in Brussels said we should draw a line up the sea. And all that does is reinforce the opinion that the Europeans don't understand the British. And unfortunately, that had a very negative impact in Britain as a whole when that came out, that idea came out.
Mr. Käfer?
Concerning the alleged tendency of politicians to make a Stodelteig. The negotiations had been executed by the European Commission. The decision had to be taken for the withdrawal agreement by the Council of the European Union. After the both negotiating parties, Great Britain, UK and European Commission had the agreement, only some days later the Council already agreed. So there has been no postponement. What concerns now the agreement of the Council to extend for about 6 months, there are two reasons. Reason one is, as we already said, we in the Europe 27 believe it would be better if UK would remain, and we think the more time passes by, the higher the likelihood is that there is an option found that they can remain. And the second issue is international politics. At the Council 4 weeks ago or 5 weeks ago, when this decision has been taken, there was of course the blame game. There have been some member states already been reluctant to postpone, but no one nobody wanted to go into the history books as being the one member state breaking the deal. And so they have been quiet, calm, and so it has been carried on.
There were two questions from the audience that were sent to us before. Maybe I just ask them. In fact, we were talking about the impact of Brexit on the free movement of goods and services. Are there any more details, any more facts that you would like to share with us? Okay, then there was a question over there.
Question is about Scotland. As back in 2016, they voted to stay. So, and maybe you can a bit comment what could be like possible scenarios. So they will negotiate whatever technical solution for Irish border. So, and then Scottish people will say, hey, here is technical solution in place. Let's go back to voting. We want back to European Union.
Yes, this is the problem with being a united kingdom of different parts, that Scotland and England are not the same country. They have different legal systems, they have a common monarch and a common government, common parliament, but they have their own assemblies. And they are, you know, the Scots are not the English, and people in Scotland get very upset when Americans say Scotland is in England, and they don't understand this. I think the issue with Scotland is that it has for some time harboured the intention or the desire for more and more independence from Britain, and I think. From the United Kingdom, if you like. I think the issue that many Scots feel an emotional desire for independence, but economically, I think it's a very tough argument. I'm not Scottish, although my ancestry is Scottish, funnily enough. I think the issue for Scotland is that the amount of support it would need economically from, let's say, the European Union to be a viable economy in the long run would be much more than most people in Scotland believe. And there is this issue that if Britain leaves and then Scotland becomes somehow independent and applies to Europe to join, it has to meet certain criteria, and rightly so, which it probably wouldn't meet economically. I think this is the issue. So I think that emotionally, the Scots would like more independence, but practically speaking, I'm not sure how that can work. The Scots would like to be part of the European Union, and they voted in Scotland more to be part. So Scotland and London voted to stay. All the rest of England and Wales voted not to, and Northern Ireland wanted to stay. The issue, of course, is that England has a much higher population, so the balance, of course, came over for the whole of the kingdom to remain. So I'm not sure how to answer the Scottish question. I think we have to wait and see. At the moment, the discussions in Britain about another referendum in Scotland for independence, which you may have heard have been being pushed, are being seen in London as being just opportunist, just another way of spoiling the discussion and distracting what we must do, which is get Brexit sorted out. Once we've got Brexit sorted out and settled, maybe the Scots should have this other discussion and have it more. And if the Scots want to be independent and then as a separate country somehow apply to join the European Union, that would be a matter for them. I can't see it happening, to be quite frank, personally.
I would just like to add, Scotland needs the permit of Westminster to do a second independence referendum. And it would not get this permit right now. And even if Scotland gets independent, don't forget Spain. imagine that Scotland will apply for European Union membership, and Spain would never allow it with the case of Catalonia.
As for referendum, Jeremy, how probable is a second referendum on the topic of Brexit?
How probable? I don't know. I wouldn't bet on it one way or the other. I think, on the one hand, the government is saying the British people voted by a very small amount, but they voted to leave. We should enact the wish of the people. Even if, as I showed on the graphics, opinion has changed since the vote took place more than 3 years ago. That's the one hand. The other hand is the Labour Party, so the more socialist political grouping in the UK, is now making part of its manifesto, part of its policy, that a second referendum should be held. Not to stay or leave, but to accept or not accept the deal that has been negotiated. Personally, I think that would be a problem, because what if they voted to reject the deal, but not to rejoin the European Union? Then we have to start completely again. I mean, the problem with referendums generally, and I'm not sure Austria doesn't have a strong history of referendums. I don't know. I know Switzerland does, of course, but the problem is the question that is asked has to be very straightforward and be able to be answered by a yes or a no, or a choice of 1, 2, 3, or something like this. If you have complicated questions, the voters will not understand the question. Many voters won't understand the question. So they will be influenced by the press, by politicians, to accept one or the other. Like last time, we saw all the millions that could come back to Britain if you vote to leave. Clearly that's wrong. But that was how the publicity was done at the time. I think the issue with the referendum is how to make sure that the question is the right question. And Parliament will then have an enormously long debate and discussion, and I don't think Parliament will be able to agree on what the question should be. At the moment, Parliament shows no sign of being able to agree on anything. And so to agree on something very important, like what is the question, I think they wouldn't stand a chance. So the easiest solution is to continue without a referendum. The referendum was held, a vote was taken, it was only small, and maybe now if you had it again it would be the other way round, but the action should be implemented. That's what a lot of people are saying, and I can understand why they would say that.
One more statement from the European Commission.
I would like to ask a question to exactly this topic. For example, why didn't you act like a company where you, for example, for every really important decision, you will need 3/4 of votes, yeah, to get a decision. And especially in your case, it was so a margin between both decisions. So I never understood it, really also not from a perspective. Yeah.
Now we get into the British way of voting, the British way of Parliament. Of course, Britain has a history and a tradition of first past the post elections. So by which I mean the one with the highest votes gets in. So if you win by 3 votes out of 3,000, you are the winner. We don't have a tradition of proportional voting, which exists in many countries in Europe, of course. To have a more balanced parliament, we tend to have an adversarial system of parliamentary democracy. The very way that our House of Commons is laid out, you've seen it, it's opposite sides. It's not a nice circle where people can have discussions like the European Union, the European Parliament. It's an adversarial system of government. Our legal system is an adversarial system of law. This has been the case for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I think you're right. If it were a company, you'd say, look, this is a very important decision. We need a big majority here. We don't just need a little majority. But that wasn't what was stated at the beginning. And I don't know, I have to say, I'm not a political expert. I don't know in other European countries whether they lay down conditions like that, for example, on referendums, where if a particular decision is made, it must be a 60 or a 70% majority or something. I don't know. Does Austria do it that way? I don't know. You have 2/3 as being as typical. So in Parliament, but
If there's a referendum, it's 50%.
so it's 50% plus one. That's it.
It was
Yeah, so if you change the constitution, you need a bigger majority, but of course we don't have a constitution in Britain. There is no bill called a constitution. We have a legal history that has an unwritten constitution, which many other countries think is really rather strange, but it's our history. And again, that's part of this deal, that our constitution is continually changing according to what's going on at the time. So what you say is very sensible. I agree. If it were a business, we would do it that way, but it's not, sadly. It's the country and its politics and its voters.
But on the other hand, everyone gained new insights during this long period already. So I think, from my point of view, now the British will have much better facts for further decisions than they had when they voted. So, and we are living all in a very fast-moving world, and we are allowed to become more clever every day.
Yeah, you're right. I think what the British will have learned from this whole experience is that when you vote for something, actually it's an important thing to do. And we had more than 70% turnout, so it was a big turnout for us. But I think they will also have learned that things can change, that if you're going to vote for something serious, maybe it's important that it's a bigger deal. Maybe it should be an absolute majority of the population, of the voting population, for example, not just the people that vote. Maybe. And I think there may well be political change and statutory change that results from this experience, but that's a bit too late for this experience, unfortunately.
Sorry to add, the point is the referendum was not legally binding. The British referendum was not legally binding, and the PM could have said, I ignore it, and I just continue like I do. And then, but Theresa May said, okay, this is the will of our population, and then she brought it into Parliament. So this is the point. We need, you have to look at the votes you need in Parliament and not at the referendum.
Yes, you're right. In Britain, referendums are not legally binding. They are a survey of opinion. But I guess the judgment of the politicians was, having asked the public, you could not then say, well, thank you for telling us that, but we're going to ignore it. But that would have been a constitutional nightmare, I think, and would have led to, the government resigning and holding an election, which it did anyway, of course. I think that you're right, they're not legally binding, but any referendum that has ever been held in Britain has always been enacted. So yes, by Parliament. So the problem is the population thought one thing, but Parliament thought something else. And so Parliament are scratching their head how to implement something that we don't agree with. Difficult.
Okay, the last question, because we are running out of time.
Okay, back to the economic side of the whole thing. There had been people before the referendum promising a future of milk and honey for the UK outside the European community, with trade deals all over the world, with all the Commonwealth countries or wherever. Is there any sign on the horizon that those things materialize?
Well, as far as I know, Britain was successful with concluding trade agreements with non-important countries. So they have a few trade agreements, but those countries do not matter for British economy. And the small ones, maybe the biggest one is Switzerland. They do have they are not, and this is also very important, they are not in force yet because Britain is still a member state and not allowed to have the trade agreement to be entered into force. But the big trade agreements you are referring to, we are still missing.
Yes, there's a slight, is it catch-22? If I say catch-22, you know what I mean. It's a circular problem that Britain is not permitted to negotiate a trade agreement while it is a member of the European Union. It can only make suggestions to people. Maybe they would like to have a trade agreement in principle, for example. But it cannot negotiate these things until it leaves the European Union. But when it leaves the European Union, it needs the trade agreement to apply from that day, which means that there will always be a period where we work on World Trade Organization rules or whatever else has been permitted under the agreement. And you're right, the big agreements with countries like the United States, with China, with other big trading partners would have to be negotiated very quickly, and therefore there's a risk they would be negotiated badly. And I think part of the problem in Britain is that we don't know how to get out of that cycle. We feel there is a feeling in Britain that the European Union wants to have its cake and eat it. You know, I mentioned that phrase earlier on. It wants us to be able to make a relatively straightforward transition from being a member to not being a member, but will not allow us to negotiate separate agreements with countries until we have left, which means that we're always going to have a big step. We're going to fall off, and we may trip up. It could be a problem. In reality, I'm not sure how that will work. I'd be interested to hear from the Commission in that respect.
Just to end, I would just have two very small questions. First question to the audience. Who of you has business relationship with Great Britain, United Kingdom? Okay, so really the minority, so for the rest it's a general political interest. Thank you. And the small question to you, what I never understood. The United Kingdom is able to organize elections to the EP within 4 weeks. On the other hand, they say it takes 6 months to prepare a second referendum. This is not logical to me.
I agree, it's not logical, but maybe that's what being British is about. Actually, it's about not being logical at all. And I can't add anything to that. But you're right, of course, the European elections are now coming up. We had hoped in Britain that we would have left by now, or at least that was the plan. Of course, it's not the case. So very quickly, we are legally obliged to offer our people the opportunity to vote in elections for the European Parliament. And the candidates that win these elections may never stand, may never take their seats, because I think the 1st of July, isn't it, the date of the European Parliament? 30th of June. So it could be that Britain has successfully agreed to leave the European Union by the 30th of June, so these people will never come to Brussels. Funnily enough, I don't think that will happen, based on past experience. So Nigel Farage, the hero or villain of this comedy or tragedy, depending upon which way you view it, will again be back in Brussels, because the following for his new party, called the Brexit Party, is very strong in Britain at the moment, because it's a protest party. And there are big discussions, of course, separately about the value of protest parties in all countries. But of course in Britain we have a very special condition that there is now a Brexit party, which is a big protest party. Most of, I think it's running at about 35 or 36% last time I looked, support. Fantastic for a party that it will never govern, it will never have any representation in Britain, it will only have representation in Europe. Because the British people who want to leave will be voting for it, saying, why haven't we left yet? I'm going to vote for them. so they can make a fuss and they can prove that we should have left. In the same way that we have a system in Britain where if you want Parliament to discuss something, you can put an electronic poll to have Parliament to discuss something. 6 million people voted on an electronic poll to discuss to propose not leaving the EU. Well, that's perfectly natural, isn't it? Because when the vote took place, there were more than double that number who voted not to leave. So it's not surprising that half of that number will vote electronically to say Parliament should put a motion to not leave. Of course. It's democracy gone mad, isn't it, really? And on that note, we should probably better stop, I think. Is that right? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this interesting discussion. We could talk for hours. Thank you to our experts. Thank you for to you for your questions. Of course, we cannot solve the problem at the moment, but I hope that thanks to the discussion today, we could give some more insights into this topic, give you more information to prepare for Brexit, to be able to advise your clients more specifically. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen, but every change is a chance as well. So all of us, we are consultants, and it's up to us to take this chance and use it. Thank you very much, and enjoy the buffet and networking.